Again, Mrs. Atkinson, give us a preliminary overview of fiscal year 2019 budget.
Okay, so as you may recall, and for those of you that are new, each year we present the preliminary budget information, giving you a brief picture of what is happening at the state level and what we are anticipating for the district through the end of this year and looking into the next. Before we get too far along, I kind of wanted to go over some definitions, some terminology that you're going to see throughout the presentation and the other budget presentations the rest of this fiscal year. So start with the state adequacy target. This is determined by looking at approximately 150 performance districts across the state, and a performance district is one that scores a perfect score on the annual performance report that is submitted to DESE. DESE then looks at the average amount that these particular districts spend to educate their students. Currently, the SAT is set at $6,241 per average daily attendance. So, average daily attendance. That is truly simply the average number of students in attendance each school day. Then we come down to weighted ADA, or weighted average daily attendance. This is the ADA multiplied by a threshold percentage that is given to us by DESE to determine if there is a higher concentration of students in subgroups that require more resources to educate. If so, that number then is multiplied by a given weight, again given to us by DESE, and the district will receive additional funding for those students. Those weighted subgroups include special education, limited English language proficiency students, and low income. Then we have DVM, the dollar value modifier. That's a cost of living adjustment that provides more money to districts in areas of the state with a higher cost of living than the state median. Then local effort. That is simply our local property tax revenue. That being said, in the foundation formula, that amount of local effort that is used is a constant figure based on the 2005 level of effort. What this does is allows the district to potentially experience revenue growth as the district's assessed valuation increases. Okay, so sources of revenue, as you can see here, almost 35% of our revenue comes from the state basic foundation formula. The second largest portion of our revenue comes from property taxes. And then just the trends of our source of revenue, you can see here, they for the most part have remained relatively steady over the last few years, so not too much change of where we receive our revenues. So let's talk about kind of what's happening at the state level. The original legislative session revenue estimate was at 3.8% growth over last year. They've kind of revised that down to 1.9%. And through March of this year, general revenue collections are up 4.4% over the same time last year. In other areas, classroom trust fund, so this is revenue from lottery participation. Collections are slightly below the state budget projections. So right now, our March payment was $404 per ADA. Prop C revenues are pretty steady. So that's the 1% statewide sales tax. And we're estimating right now that we're going to have a $988 per weighted ADA payment for fiscal year 18. And the SAT in March has now been fully funded, actually for the last couple of months, at $6,241. So a couple of items to note at the state level. First is in regard to the most recent guidance from DESE regarding pre-K funding. So House Bill 1689 stated that pre-K is funded as soon as the state formula is fully funded. So that now has been determined, that definition of fully funded by DESE is being interpreted as appropriated, not necessarily just dispersed. So what that means is that funding will begin in fiscal year 20. That's when we receive payments on those. We'll begin reporting our pre-K students in our fiscal year 19 ADA. Next item of note is funding for public education. The governor is currently recommending a $51 million increase to public education over current year. The House, however, is recommending $98 million increase. So as you can see, that's a pretty wide range right now. We're certainly hoping that it will come in at closer to that $98 million. So we'll keep an eye on that as things move forward at the state, in the legislature. Foundation formula basics. So the formula, again, was approved in 2005, and it's really meant to provide adequate funding for students, not necessarily equitable. I already discussed the performance districts. The calculation is simply weighted ADA times the SAT times the DVM, and then subtracting the 2005 amount of local effort, and then that gets us to our annual state funding amount. The state adequacy target is recalculated every 2 years. So it has just recently been recalculated for the next 2 years at $6,375. However, it is increased incrementally over 2 years. So for fiscal year 19, it will be $6,309, and fiscal year 20 is then $6,375. So I mentioned the weighting thresholds earlier. So this is just kind of a little glance back at the last few years and into 18, 19, 19, 20. As you can see here, the weighting thresholds used to determine weighted ADA have decreased for free and reduced lunch and special education from the last couple of years. So those threshold changes alone are estimated to increase our revenues by just under $174,000 for fiscal year 19. And the reason for the increase is that the district receives additional funding for student population subgroups over the threshold calculation. So the lower the threshold, the sooner we reach a weighted ADA that results in more funding. And again, those subgroups are low income, special education, and English language proficiency. So let's dive a little deeper into early childhood funding. Stated that it's going to take place in fiscal year 20. It will be based on ADA from fiscal year 19. So what that means is that, let me back up here. What that means for the district is that while we can report ADA, it's not all of our pre-K students. It cannot include the early childhood students we're already receiving, or early childhood special ed students rather, we're already receiving funding from them, from the state and federal government. So what we can include is 4% of our free and reduced count for our total K-12 student population. So right now that means we can include up to 75 total early childhood students. We currently only have 60 in our district. And then they also have to be eligible for free and reduced lunch. So right now we're looking at about 20 students that we could possibly count in next year's ADA. I would say here that it could have a future positive impact. I say could simply because by adding pre-K funding to public education, there's only so much money to go around. So if we don't add more money to public education, it could have a negative impact on the SAT in terms of either lowering the SAT or having withholdings for funding. The $98 million increase to education funding that I mentioned that the House is in the House budget does account for full funding of the formula, including pre-K. So we're, again, hoping for closer to $98 million for the budget. So this here is just to illustrate the change in revenue from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 19, assuming there's been no change to the SAT, so the calculation at 6241 SAT, and then moving forward to full funding at 6308. So the first column is this year. Second column is 6241, only accounting for the threshold changes. Again, I already mentioned that's about an increase of $174,000. Full funding increases revenue another just about $273 for a total increase, again assuming full funding, of about $446,000 over current year. So local property taxes. We take assessed valuation times the tax rate times historical collection rate to equal budgeted property taxes for the year. Preliminary estimates, I'm using the December 31st assessed valuation, which is just under $407 million. That does not include the assessed valuation amount and corresponding TIF for the West Side Marketplace. I have reached out to Mr. Stoltz, our assessor, to find out when that might come onto our tax rolls. I'm still waiting to hear back, so I can keep you all posted on that. So Proposition C, again, that's the 1% statewide sales tax that was passed in 1982. And like I mentioned earlier, it continues to be a solid revenue source. So DESE is estimated at $988 per weighted ADA payment for this year. and a range of anywhere between $988 and $1,006 per weighted ADA for next year. So for the budget purposes, I'm just using the figure of $1,000 per weighted ADA, which will increase about $124,000 to our revenues. This is just to show, illustrate that Prop C revenues have continued to steadily increase over the last few years. And then recapping the major revenue changes in our major sources of revenue. Bottom line is a range of anywhere from just over $1 million to $1.2 million, depending on where the SAT comes in. So moving on to expenditures. Most of you are aware that about 80% of our operating expenditures go to salaries and benefits. So we spend a lot of time talking about that, making sure that our estimates are pretty darn accurate. So just going through some assumptions here, assuming that we increase health insurance premiums by 10%, and just to be clear, we have not had all of our meetings to determine and have any recommendation on how much we want to increase. But taking that 10% and calculating the retirement calculations on it would increase our operating expenditures by $372,000. Movement on the salary schedules, $388,200 increase, and for each percentage increase to the base is another $288,900. This is a very small recap of where we came in last year on the annual Secretary of the Board report. So this is a report that we are required to submit to DESE by August 15th each year. And our ending fund balance last year was at just over 33%. And that fund balance represents the level of operating reserves the district has available to pay invoices, salaries, and benefits, assuming that we have no revenue. So the board voted, I think it was several years ago now, to have an ending fund balance of no less than 17%. What this does is allow the district to have approximately 3 months of reserves to pay our obligations. So it's kind of a glance back at our last few years of ending fund balances. As you can see, they have decreased. We are intentionally deficit spending, at least over the last few years. Right now, after the most recent budget update that I did last month, we're budgeted to have an ending fund balance this year of just over 24%. So that being said, due to the timing of district budget decisions versus the timing of the state budget and the unknown, all the unknowns with the state budget and how much in collections they're actually going to receive, we intentionally budget conservatively. In addition, our administrators, I think, are very responsible with their own building budgets and department budgets throughout the year. So I'm currently projecting an ending operating fund balance to be closer to about 29.5%. So not quite as much of a deficit as what we're budgeted for, so we'll see how we do there. So it's kind of a recap of our ending fund balance, the budgeted versus projected. I've also included here our current Fund 4 capital projects fund balance. So going over the budget process, I'd really like to take a moment to thank everybody that has given input over the last few months and continues to do so. In early January of each year, we begin meeting with each of our building administrators, program directors, the Salary and Welfare Committee, and the Supporting Student Success Committee. We continue meeting with those groups as necessary up until pretty much the June board meeting, when the final budget is then presented. So going over the timeline for the budget, the board's presented with and asked to approve various pieces of the budget as we move through this process. We began that with the supply, textbooks, and equipment budget that you approved on January 18th, and it will end with the entire budget proposal on June 7th. Okay, that was a lot. Are there any questions or concerns at this
I would just
time?
add, we have scheduled meetings with salary welfare next week and up to the 26th board meeting as well, anticipating action on the salary recommendation for May 10th. So following the perpetual calendar, leading back to the TAB committee discussion, we have two, and for Dr. Creedy, for his information, we have two committees. Supporting student success is our support staff meet and confer committee. So there's representatives from each building and each department that come, and Mr. Henshaw meets with them during lunch. We talk about the same things relative to health insurance, to salary recommendations, to work environment type activities that he meets with them. We all meet with the teacher representatives on the salary welfare committee, and that's every building, every level. It's a committee of a dozen people, and then when May 10th comes, we try to come to the board with a consensus recommendation. So it's not the teachers and the staff say they'd like to have this, and the administrators are recommending that, and we're having discussions that are opposed. So the consensus recommendation comes because this presentation gets then shown to that group, both those groups, over the next month. And then we'll know more as we head toward the end of the legislative session to know where that variance is between the $51 million appropriated by the governor's budget, or whether it be more like the House and Senate. I think the Senate's version is going to remain close to the House's version of $98 million. So you see that range in there. So the difficulty for us as we're making decisions about salaries 8 days before the end of the legislative session, and we have to have contracts in the hands of our teachers by May 15th. And I think we're going to know. I say I think with some degree of certainty. But I know Jim was taking me to task every year about really identifying that we over-predict our expenses and under-predict our revenues, and so the deficit's never spending is on purpose because we don't want to have too much money in the bank, but at the same time, we're fiscally responsible and preparing for worst-case scenarios should it happen. And those are all moving pieces, as Kendra pointed out, and we have to kind of nail it down to be able to deal with 80% of our budget, which is our staff. So tonight we made some moves that save us money, and the fiscal conservative nature of this district means that when positions, people leave us, we don't automatically replace. We do have concerns in some areas where we're looking at projected enrollments. We want to make sure we have the appropriate staff to student ratio, and that's our priority. So that's a lot of information. We'll go back over it as we do kind of the induction process, because the school foundation formula and school finance is usually a semester course, and then some. So you got the Reader's Digest version real quick tonight. So that's what we're working toward. So those meetings start next week. We know what the other data I would just share is that Camdenton School District does a salary survey every year, and it takes about 26 districts, Kelly, that up and down the I-44 corridor up to Jeff City, Washington, Columbia, and it compares school districts at random places on their salary schedules, and then they give that information out to us. And one of the goals that we've had as a board for many years is attract and retain quality staff. In order to do that, you compensate them well. And so that's what we've been able to do, and our board has that information, and I'll get that to you, where we rank on those random places within the salary schedule, except for the very first year teacher salary is very high, one or two. So this time of year, our colleagues are talking. Last week we were at the state superintendent's conference, and one of the questions is, so what are you going to do for salaries next year? Because like everything else, we're very competitive when it comes to that. So we kind of, within our conference, have an idea of what the schools are going to do. And it generally ranges between that 1% and 3. Camdenton's about 3.3. If you go back to that slide on movement on the salary schedule plus the percentage, when we meet with our staff, that's what we talk about. We have to quantify that. We don't know that we're going to do 10% on health insurance, as Kendra said. But we're able to say, so if you gave 2%, you double that. And when that means is you run that percentage through the salary schedule, it's indexed, and it becomes more expensive every year. And then, so if you look at what probably